Hey everyone! Tonight we're kicking things off by exploring the incredible resilience and frankly astonishing tolerance for discomfort displayed by the Viking people. These were folks who somehow survived brutal Scandinavian winters without modern heating systems. Before you get too cozy watching this, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely appreciate what we're doing here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see our global community tuning in. Now, let's set the mood. Dim those lights. Maybe turn on a fan for some ambient white noise, or a space heater if you're feeling historically inaccurate. And let's begin tonight's journey together. When temperatures outside plunged to absolutely not levels, Vikings didn't panic. They simply retreated into their longhouses, those massive, low-ceilinged structures that were only slightly more breathable than a modern sauna built inside a cow barn. These longhouses served as Viking winter bunkers, constructed primarily from timber if you lived near forests, or from turf and stone if you didn't. Built low to conserve heat and wide enough to accommodate multiple families, plus occasionally some strategically placed livestock, because nothing says cozy like sleeping next to cud-chewing, steam-farting animals. These structures functioned as communal thermal batteries. Human bodies, animal bodies, and a central fire pit all operated in warm, unventilated harmony, less like houses and more like survival cuddle bunkers. The hearth running through the center served as both stove and space heater. Chimneys hadn't been invented yet, or more accurately, they existed elsewhere, but not in places where people were still using bones as doorstops. So smoke would rise and collect in the rafters, sometimes finding its way out through roof holes or just hanging around to turn ceilings black and lungs into wool-lined ashtrays. To modern eyes, Viking homes would seem unbearably smoky, overcrowded, and weirdly intimate, which they absolutely were. But for Vikings, this beat the alternative of becoming human snow sculptures. Raised sleeping platforms lined the walls, typically stuffed with straw, moss, or whatever vaguely flammable materials were available. Families, and sometimes their livestock, all slept together in these shared spaces, not because they adored each other's company, but because staying warm wasn't optional and personal privacy hadn't been invented yet. In short, Viking longhouses prioritized survival over comfort. They kept people alive through brutal winters, even if they didn't do much for personal hygiene or quality sleep. When it came to fashion, Vikings cared less about runway trends and more about not freezing to death before breakfast. If there was one thing Norse people understood better than raiding, it was strategic layering. And we're not talking scarves and mittens here. We're talking full-body wool armor reinforced with fur, leather, and zero shame. The base layer might be linen if you were lucky enough to own some, breathable and good for wicking sweat, but expensive and easily torn. But most people went straight to wool. Lots and lots of wool. Men wore tunics over trousers with leg wraps that functioned as ancient thermal leggings, while women wore long woolen dresses layered with aprons and cloaks. Everyone used belts to keep everything in place, plus pouches for essentials like knives, flint, or emergency cheese rations. Cloaks were absolutely essential, fastened with brooches, sometimes fur-lined, and if you didn't have one, your survival prospects looked grim. Footwear consisted of animal hide boots, often from cattle or seals, waterproofed with generous amounts of fat, not pretty, but effective at keeping out wind and moisture, though you'd smell like a jerky factory. For the truly hardcore, cleaned and dried animal intestines could be fashioned into waterproof layers, not breathable, but excellent at keeping out snow and rain, and nobody questioned your fashion choices when you were literally wrapped in internal organs. Hats, mittens, and scarves were standard issue, typically made from felted wool, beaten into dense, warm mats. And if you lacked gloves, you just stuff your hands in your cloak and hope nobody noticed your fingers turning blue. Their winter cuisine followed one simple rule: eat like your life depends on it, because it did. Viking winter meals weren't gourmet, but they were calorie-dense, fatty, and aggressively practical. The staples? Meat, dairy, grains, and preserved fish. Lots and lots of preserved fish. They prepared it every way imaginable: smoked, salted, dried, fermented, with zero apologies. Take lutefisk for example. White fish soaked in lye until it became equal parts food and dare. Not delicious, but impressively resistant to spoilage. For heartier options, stews were the go-to. Vikings would throw whatever they had into a pot over the hearth. Meat scraps, root vegetables, oats, even sour milk. The longer it cooked, the better. The results might not win culinary awards, but they'd stick to your ribs and possibly to the bowl. Dairy products made during warmer months became winter ration staples. Cheese and butter that bore little resemblance to modern varieties. Think hard, salty, wheel-shaped milk solids perfect for chewing, trading, or hurling at wolves. They also made skyr, something between yogurt and cheese, and definitely an acquired taste. The culinary equivalent of a wake-up slap, protein-rich and mouth-puckeringly sour. Grains like barley and rye formed the basis for dense flatbreads and porridge, sometimes baked with crushed tree bark to stretch supplies further. Not tasty, but effective at maintaining blood sugar. And of course, alcohol. Ale and mead weren't just for celebrations. They provided calories, mild antiseptic properties, and comfort when your toes went numb. If it tasted terrible, even better, nobody would steal your stash. When winter hit hardest, Vikings turned to their most reliable heat source, other mammals. Bringing animals indoors wasn't considered strange, it was survival efficiency. Chickens, pigs, sheep, goats, and even cattle were welcomed into longhouses not for companionship, but for body heat, essentially medieval central heating powered by livestock sounds and smells. These animals typically occupied a section called the byre, basically a garage meat stable area separated from human quarters by a low wall, close enough to share warmth, but hopefully not close enough for unexpected hoof encounters. On the coldest nights, these boundaries blurred. Families might huddle closer to livestock areas. Children might nap beside sheep. And if an ox was warm and willing, congratulations, that's your pillow now. Not cozy by modern standards, but undeniably effective. The logic was simple. Animals generate heat. A cow produces as much warmth as a small campfire without needing kindling. In extreme conditions, this could mean the difference between frostbite and mild annoyance at barnyard noises. Of course, the downsides included constant noise, overwhelming smells, and occasional misplaced hooves. But Vikings didn't complain. They understood a fundamental truth: warmth now, dignity later. This practice also protected valuable livestock from predators and thieves while keeping them from freezing outside. In many ways, longhouses were designed around this concept. Builders intentionally channeled warmth from animal areas toward human living spaces. It was architecture driven by survival instinct. Simple, effective, and unapologetically fragrant. Huddling wasn't just about warmth, it was survival engineering. Families slept shoulder to shoulder on raised wooden platforms, buried under layers of wool and whatever scraps of hide hadn't been repurposed for roof repairs. Privacy? A myth. Comfort? A rumor. But shared warmth? That was non-negotiable. Children wedged between parents, elders treated like heated relics. Even dogs and cats pulled double duty as living space heaters. Everyone packed in tight, breathing air thick with the scent of smoke, damp wool, and whatever had been stewing over the fire, all while pretending not to hear Uncle Bjorn's thunderous snoring. Yet this wasn't just physical survival. Winter isolation could rot the mind faster than frostbite could claim toes. That's where Viking humor came in, rough, blunt, and weaponized against despair. They told sagas of warriors freezing to death heroically, somehow uplifting, roasted each other with merciless wit, zero filter, and turned tripping into a latrine into communal comedy. Nothing fought seasonal depression like mocking your cousin's misfortune over a mug of mead. Feasts were another lifeline. Midwinter meant hauling out food hoarded since autumn, not just to celebrate Yule, but to scream into the void. We're still here, and look, we've got turnips. Games erupted indoors. Riddles, wrestling matches that toppled livestock, and Nefataful, a board game best described as chess with more betrayal. The goal? Distraction from the cold, the dark, and the gnawing fear that spring might never come. But their greatest weapon was mindset. Vikings didn't just endure winter, they expected it to be brutal. No whining, no delusions of entitlement to comfort. Misery was the default, anything better was a bonus. Their culture trained this resilience from birth. Weakness wasn't mocked, it was ignored. Children learned early. Numb fingers? Use your elbows. Toes frozen? Walk faster. Fall through ice and live. Congrats, you're now interesting. This wasn't just cultural, it was spiritual. Norse mythology brimmed with frost giants and Fimbulwinter, the endless freeze heralding the apocalypse. When your creation myths featured cosmic ice, a little snow was nothing. Even their insults doubled as survival tips. You're so cold, your tears froze before they hit your chin. Insulation, Viking style, involved stuffing nature into walls like a life or death craft project. Longhouses weren't drafty by accident, they were thermal traps. Walls up to a meter thick used moss, straw, mud, or even animal hair as filler, not glamorous, but neither was frostbite. Roofs, thatched or layered with sod, accidental indoor gardening included. Floors, packed earth strewn with straw, swapped out when the stench overwhelmed even Viking standards. Windows, rare and tiny. Light came from fire or smoke holes, because glass was precious and staring at endless night wasn't helpful. Yet this slapdash mix of timber, turf, and questionable biology worked. It turned longhouses into slow cookers of body heat and livestock breath, holding back Scandinavian winters through sheer stubbornness. Not a spa, not breathable, definitely not up to code, but it kept families alive, warmish, smoky, and just functional enough to confuse insects. Sleep was another battlefield. Viking beds were thermal strategy, not comfort. Wooden platforms topped with straw or moss, layered with furs and resignation. No pajamas. Changing clothes in sub-zero temps was a death wish. Boots stayed on. Infants were swaddled and held close. Kids sandwiched between adults, less for bonding, more for heat distribution. Couples shared space, but so did everyone else. Modesty? Please. If someone's foot strayed under the furs, it was called survival, not scandal. Wealthier households sometimes used heated stones under bedding. Viking-era hot water bottles, minus the water, and with a side of burn risk. If the fire died at night, you pulled someone closer and growled, "Steal the fur again, and I'll feed you to the goats." Smoke management was aspirational. In theory, it rose through roof vents. In practice, it clung to rafters like an uninvited guest before settling into lungs. You didn't breathe air in a longhouse. You breathed experience. By winter's end, your chest felt like it had smoked a side of venison. Oddly, this had upsides. Smoke preserved meat hung from ceilings, repelled insects, and probably gave Vikings lungs like Victorian chimney sweeps. The downsides? Red eyes, hacking coughs, and ceilings darker than Odin's mood. Some families slept lower to avoid the worst haze. Others just powered through, squinting through watery eyes as they navigated goat-obstructed floors. A few upscale homes had smoke holes, but most just accepted that warmth came with a side of asphyxiation. Yule was the ultimate defiance. When the sun basically quit for weeks, Vikings responded with fire, feasting, and mead-fueled yelling. This wasn't just celebration, it was psychological warfare against despair. Sacrifices for blessings and dinner, bonfires that mocked the darkness, and the Yule log, an actual tree trunk burned for days as a middle finger to winter. Superstition seeped in too. Winter was when spirits and trolls wandered, so rituals and charms multiplied, essentially. Don't let ghosts steal our goats. Many Yule traditions, evergreens, gift-giving, dragging trees indoors, later morphed into Christmas customs. But at its core, Yule was about endurance. In a world without light switches or vitamin D, Vikings manufactured joy from scratch, fire, food, an unshakable belief that winter would end. And if it didn't, at least you'd die full and with a good story. Wool was the unsung hero. While gold glittered and silver shone, wool endured. It was spun into cloaks, socks, mittens, and underlayers. Anything that could be wool was. Unlike cotton, which turned wet and clingy like a cold betrayal. Wool retained heat even when damp. Every household raised sheep not for pets or milk, but for their glorious, itchy miracle coats. Spinning wool was women's work, a year-round job that became vital in winter. Viking fashion wasn't runway ready, but it was tailored. Tunics fitted for mobility, cloaks designed to allow arm movement, leg wraps secured to prevent tripping mid-blizzard. Quality wool signaled status. Coarse meant poor, but practical. Soft, tightly woven wool equaled luxury, the Viking-era cashmere. Felt was another innovation. Wool beaten into windproof mats for hats, boots, or wall insulation. Nothing was wasted. Scraps became socks or stuffing. A good cloak could last generations, unless it burned, blew away, or was buried with you as grave goods. Saunas and ice baths. Vikings loved them. Their bad stofa, sweat lodges, were small, smoky huts where they'd bake half-naked, then sprint outside to roll in snow, voluntarily. This hot-cold shock therapy wasn't just machismo. It boosted circulation, cleared sinuses, and made you forget, briefly, that you lived in a livestock-scented shed. Communal saunas doubled as birthing rooms, hospitals, and social hubs. Families sweated together, bonding while steaming out regrets. Modern Nordic countries kept this tradition, minus the goats. Winter was also repair season, sharpening weapons, mending clothes. That October hole in your tunic better be patched by December, and crafting tools. Women and children spun wool into yarn for hours. Men carved bone combs or antler needles. The longhouse became a hive of productivity, and occasional swearing when someone dropped a needle in the straw. Storytelling was the ultimate survival tool. Without Netflix, there were sagas, epic tales of gods, heroes, and that one uncle who made terrible life choices. Each telling grew wilder. Thor didn't just kill the giant. He punched the moon afterward, probably. Games like Nefatiful and dice, gambling included, passed time, while mead made everything funnier, especially family squabbles. The Vikings didn't just survive winter, they weaponized it. Every layer of wool, every lungful of smoke, every crude joke around the hearth was part of an intricate cultural blueprint for endurance. Winter wasn't an obstacle. It was an opponent they'd trained their entire lives to face. While other civilizations slowed down during the cold months, Vikings used the time to sharpen axes, repair ships, and plot spring raids. When the ice finally thawed, they didn't stumble blinking into the sunlight. They emerged battle-ready. This winter-hardening process began in childhood. Viking kids learned early that complaining about numb fingers earned you nothing but scorn. The solution? Move them. Can't feel your toes? Walk faster. Fell through ice and lived? Congratulations, you just earned yourself a new saga. Their games weren't gentle. Wrestling matches often spilled into livestock pens, and the popular board game Nefatiful was essentially chess if every piece was allowed to betray the king. The message was clear. Discomfort wasn't exceptional. It was expected. This mindset was baked into their spirituality. Norse mythology featured Fimbulwinter, an apocalyptic 3-year freeze that would precede Ragnarok. When your creation myth starts with cosmic ice, a little snowfall hardly registers. Even their insults doubled as survival advice. You're so cold, your tears froze before they hit your chin. Try blinking less. The longhouse itself was a masterclass in thermal engineering. Walls up to a meter thick were stuffed with whatever fibrous material was available: moss, straw, even horsehair. Roofs alternated between thatch and sod, which occasionally sprouted mushrooms, providing accidental midwinter snacks. Floors were packed earth covered in rushes, swapped out whenever the smell overpowered even Viking standards. Windows? Almost non-existent. Glass was precious, and staring at endless night wasn't improving morale anyway. What emerged was a structure that functioned like a slow cooker, trapping body heat, livestock breath, and wood smoke in a dense, survivable fog. Not comfortable, not hygienic, but brutally effective. The average longhouse maintained temperatures just above freezing, enough to prevent frostbite, if not frosty toes. Sleep arrangements followed military precision. Raised wooden platforms lined the walls, layered with straw and whatever furs weren't being used to patch the roof. Privacy was laughable. Entire families slept shoulder to shoulder, children wedged between adults like living insulation. Elders were strategically placed near heat sources, honored relics doubling as space heaters. Even courtship was pragmatic. Couples shared bedding not for romance, but because frozen limbs made terrible weapons. Wealthier households sometimes used heated stones, the Viking equivalent of hot water bottles, minus the water, and with a 50% chance of third-degree burns. If the central fire died during the night, you didn't relight it. You grabbed the nearest warm body and muttered threats about stolen furs through chattering teeth. Smoke management was aspirational. In theory, it rose through roof vents. In practice, it pulled along the ceiling like a vengeful spirit before eventually infiltrating every lung in the building. By midwinter, your respiratory system resembled a smoked ham. But there were unexpected benefits. The constant haze preserved meat hung from the rafters, deterred insects, and may have given Vikings the lung capacity of Victorian factory workers. The downsides? Bloodshot eyes, perpetual coughs, and ceilings stained blacker than Loki's conscience. Some families slept on lower platforms to avoid the worst of it. Others simply accepted that breathing was optional if it meant staying warm. A few upscale longhouses featured proper smoke holes, but most made do with the occasional open door, briefly trading suffocation for frostbite in a lose-lose negotiation. Yule was their greatest defiance against the dark. When the sun essentially abandoned Scandinavia for weeks, Vikings responded with bonfires that mocked the night, feasts of carefully hoarded food, and enough mead to drown a lesser civilization. This wasn't just celebration, it was psychological warfare. The Yule log, an actual tree trunk burned for days, became a middle finger to winter itself. Superstition crept in too. The long nights were thought to thin the veil between worlds, letting spirits and trolls wander freely. Households hung charms, made offerings, and, critically, guarded their livestock. No, ghost, you can't have our last goat. Many Yule traditions, evergreens, gift exchanges, hauling trees indoors, later evolved into Christmas customs. But at its core, the festival was about one thing: proving you'd outlasted winter again. Wool was their secret weapon. While other cultures prized gold or silver, Vikings worshipped at the altar of lanolin. Every household kept sheep not for meat or milk, but for their endless supply of scratchy miracles. Women and children spent winter months spinning raw fleece into yarn, a chore that blended monotony with survival necessity. Finish this cloak, or lose toes. Their clothing was engineering, not fashion. Tunics were cut for mobility, cloaks designed to shed snow, and leg wraps secured so tightly they'd make modern hikers weep. Quality wool marked social status. Coarse meant practical poverty. Finely woven meant luxury, the Viking equivalent of designer labels. Even their waterproofing was ingenious. Boots slathered in animal fat, rain cloaks made from boiled intestines. Smells like death, but beats hypothermia. Nothing was wasted. Cloaks were patched until they disintegrated. Scraps became mittens or insulation. A well-maintained woolen coat could outlive its owner, assuming it didn't get burned, stolen, or buried as a grave good. Their sauna culture revealed unexpected sophistication. The Bad Stofa, sweat lodge, was a windowless hut where Vikings baked themselves half-naked, then charged into snowbanks, voluntarily. This hot-cold shock therapy wasn't just machismo. It stimulated circulation, cleared winter congestion, and provided brief respite from livestock-scented reality. Communal saunas doubled as hospitals, birthing rooms, and social hubs, places to negotiate treaties, settle feuds, or simply sweat out poor life choices. Modern Scandinavia still embraces this tradition, though thankfully without the accompanying goat population. Winter was also repair season. Blades were sharpened, tools reforged, and every torn garment meticulously mended. That October hole in your tunic better be patched by December unless you fancy frostbite. The longhouse became a hive of low-grade industry. Women spinning wool, men carving bone tools, children learning through chores that blended survival skills with child labor. Entertainment was equally practical. Storytelling wasn't just leisure. It was mental armor against the creeping dread of endless night. Sagas blended history with mythology, turning real events into epic tales where heroes battled giants, outwitted gods, and occasionally froze to death, but heroically. Games like Nefataful, chess with more betrayal, and dice, often involving gambling, pastime, while mead ensured even family arguments became spectator sport. What emerged from this winter crucible wasn't just survival, it was a cultural edge. While other societies hibernated, Vikings honed weapons, trained children, and planned raids. Spring didn't find them weakened, it found them ready. Their ships cut through thawing fjords with crews hardened by months of communal endurance. This was the paradox of Viking winter. The same conditions that culled the weak forged the strong. Modern survival experts preach embrace the suck, a philosophy Vikings mastered a millennium ago. Their legacy isn't just conquests and longships. It's the understanding that resilience isn't given. It's built, layer by scratchy woolen layer. Abraham Lincoln's story didn't begin in the White House. It started in dirt. Literally. Born February 12, 1809, in a one-room Kentucky log cabin with a dirt floor, no windows, and more gaps than walls, Lincoln entered a world where survival wasn't guaranteed and education was an afterthought. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a hardscrabble farmer and carpenter who could swing an axe, but barely write his name. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was the opposite, quiet, literate, and gentle in a place where gentleness often got trampled by hardship. The Lincoln family lived in what historians politely call frontier poverty, which meant they owned almost nothing, ate whatever didn't eat them first, and considered shoes a luxury. Young Abe grew up chopping wood before he could properly hold the axe, hauling water from freezing creeks, and wearing clothes that were more patched than fabric. Formal schooling? Maybe a year total, scattered across random intervals when some wandering teacher passed through the wilderness. But what Lincoln lacked in schooling, he made up for with two weapons, an insatiable mind and hands that could work as hard as they could turn book pages. Then tragedy struck. When Abe was just 9, his mother drank poisoned milk, likely contaminated with trematol from white snake root, and died screaming in agony. Frontier medicine being what it was, essentially whiskey and wishful thinking, Nancy succumbed to what settlers called milk sickness. Her burial was as brutal as her death. Family members dug the grave themselves in the Kentucky forest, and young Abe, unable to afford a proper marker, carved one from wood with his own hands. It was rough, crooked, and soaked with tears, but it stood. Enter Sarah Bush Johnston, the stepmother who saved him. When Thomas Lincoln remarried a year later, he chose a widow with 3 things his first wife hadn't possessed: books, kindness, and common sense. Sarah immediately recognized something unusual in her gangly stepson, a mind that burned for knowledge. Where others saw a backwoods oddball, she saw potential. Under her influence, the Lincoln cabin acquired its first real literary treasures: Aesop's fables, Robinson Crusoe, the Bible. When paper was scarce, Abe wrote some on wooden shingles with charcoal. When candles ran low, he read by firelight until his eyes watered. By his teens, Lincoln was already the strangest boy in rural Indiana, 6 feet tall and still growing, absurdly strong from farm labor, yet prone to sudden fits of melancholy. He devoured every book he could borrow and offended more than one neighbor by forgetting to return them. He recited Shakespeare while plowing fields, debated theology with local farmers, and developed a humor so dry it could start fires. People didn't know what to make of him. That towering height, those piercing eyes, that way of speaking plain truths like they were gospel, it unsettled folks. But when he talked, even his critics listened. At 19, Lincoln got his first glimpse of the wider world and its horrors. Hired to take a flatboat down the Mississippi to New Orleans, he witnessed slavery firsthand. Chains, auctions, the casual brutality of humans treated like livestock. The images seared into him. Years later, he'd recall the way an enslaved woman's screams sounded like a wounded animal's, but worse, because you knew she was a person. That trip planted the seed of what would become an unshakable moral conviction, though it would take decades to fully bloom. Returning home, Lincoln reinvented himself in Illinois. New Salem, a rough-edged frontier town, became his proving ground. He clerked in a general store, where he earned the nickname Honest Abe for walking miles to correct a pennies overcharge. Volunteered as a militia captain in the Black Hawk War, though he never saw combat, and taught himself law by the flickering light of borrowed books. His office? A saddlebag. His desk? Tree stumps and tavern tables. What set Lincoln apart wasn't just his grit, it was his voice. That high, reedy tenor shouldn't have commanded attention, but when he spoke, something happened. He could explain complex ideas and stories any farmer understood. His humor disarmed opponents. His logic dismantled them. By 1834, he'd won a seat in the Illinois state legislature. Not through family connections, he had none, or wealth. He was perpetually in debt, but because frontier voters trusted his stubborn honesty. The 1850s transformed Lincoln from a local oddity into a national conscience. As Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, allowing new territories to decide slavery's fate, Lincoln saw moral catastrophe. He joined the new Republican Party, arguing against slavery's expansion not with fiery abolitionist rhetoric, but with cold, clear logic. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Then came 1858, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Facing Senator Stephen A. Douglas, a political titan nicknamed the Little Giant, Lincoln turned 7 brutal debates into a masterclass on democracy's moral foundations. He lost that Senate race, but won the crowd. Newspapers reprinted his words nationwide. Suddenly, people were asking, who is this prairie lawyer with the face like a hatchet and the mind like a steel trap? By 1860, America was cracking apart. Southern states threatened secession if any anti-slavery fanatic won the presidency. At the Republican convention, Lincoln wasn't the favorite, but he wasn't the most hated either. While rivals like William Seward carried baggage, Lincoln was the rail-splitter candidate, a self-made man whose very existence proved the American dream. Election night, November 6, 1860, changed everything. Lincoln won just 40% of the popular vote, but dominated the Electoral College. The South erupted. South Carolina seceded before he even took office. 6 more states followed. Death threats poured in. By the time Lincoln arrived in Washington for his inauguration, he had to sneak through Baltimore in disguise to avoid assassination. On March 4, 1861, a divided nation watched as this awkward, grieving man, his beloved son Willie had just died, took the oath. His address was firm but conciliatory. We are not enemies, but friends. It didn't matter. 5 weeks later, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. The Civil War, and Lincoln's greatest trial, had begun. As the last autumn storms battered Scandinavia's coasts, Viking settlements transformed into fortresses under siege, not by human enemies, but by the encroaching winter. This was no seasonal inconvenience. It was a yearly battle demanding meticulous preparation, where every overlooked detail could mean death by frost or starvation. The strategies developed over centuries weren't just practical. They were a cultural obsession, refined through generations of trial and catastrophic error. The food arsenal, preservation as art form. While summer's abundance faded, Viking storage pits became masterclasses in food chemistry. Along fjords, fishermen layered herring barrels with salt thicker than snowfall, creating preserves so potent they'd make a modern chef weep. Inland hunters smoked reindeer haunches over alderwood fires, the sweet sour tang of juniper berries woven into every fiber. A flavor profile still echoed in Nordic cuisine today. Dairy underwent its own metamorphosis. Skimmed milk fermented into skyr, a yogurt so tart it could strip rust from chainmail, while cream was churned into butter so precious it warranted burial in peat bogs. Nature's refrigerators that archaeologists still excavate, finding thousand-year-old pats chemically intact and theoretically edible if one ignores the earthy bouquet of decay. Vegetables weren't spared the alchemical treatment. Cabbages submerged in brine bubbled into sauerkraut, their funk mingling with the longhouse's wood smoke. Turnips and onions hibernated in straw-lined trenches, their earthy sweetness concentrating through frost cycles. Even grains weren't safe. Barley malted for winter brewing, ensuring mead and ale flowed through the darkest months. Thermal warfare, fuel stockpiling tactics. A Viking's woodpile wasn't just fuel, it was a lifeline measured in handbreadths. Families competed to stack logs higher than their rooftops, knowing each birch billet burned hotter, perfect for cooking, while pine's resinous sparks demanded constant vigilance. The wealthy hoarded oak, dense enough to glow for days like miniature suns in the hearth. When stocks dwindled, desperation bred innovation. Dried animal dung became cow coal, its acrid smoke adding another layer to the longhouse's olfactory symphony. Children were tasked with gathering birch bark strips, nature's kindling that could ignite even when damp. The truly resourceful raided beaver dams for pre-cut timber, a tactic that blurred the line between clever and criminal. Textile armor, dressing for the Ice Age. Autumn's last weeks saw women spinning wool with frenetic urgency, their drop spindles whirling like miniature blizzards. Every garment underwent militarized reinforcement. Mittens grew woolen liners stuffed with eiderdown, plundered from duck nests. Leg wraps were wound tighter than ship rigging, creating makeshift thermal barriers. Cloaks received their annual tar baptism, boiled in birch pitch until waterproof enough to shrug off sleet. Footwear entered crisis mode. Leather boots got resoled with moose hide, the seams waterproofed with a revolting mix of fish oil and beeswax. Those lacking resources resorted to shoe socks, foot-shaped bags of felted wool that provided warmth but dissolved in wet snow, leading to frostbite gambles. Livestock calculus, the brutal economics of survival. As pastures froze, Viking farmers faced grim trade-off. Only animals earning their keep survived indoors. Milking cows, priority number one, liquid gold for nutrition. Breeding stock, future insurance. The rest became salted meat, their hides stretched for clothing, bones carved into tools. The autumn slaughter was a festival of efficiency, so thorough even entrails were repurposed. Intestines became sausage casings, stomachs transformed into water carriers, and hooves boiled into glue for emergency repairs. Longhouse fortifications, architecture against the elements. Pre-winter maintenance was a family affair. Roof patrols, children scrambled like squirrels to plug leaks with turf bricks. Wall reinforcements, a mortar of mud, moss, and livestock hair filled cracks, unwittingly creating ideal flea habitats. Floor upgrades, fresh rushes layered over old, the bottom strata composting gently beneath foot traffic. Wealthier households laid wooden floorboards, but most endured dirt floors that morphed into muddy swamps when snow melted off boots. Hence the ubiquitous nail log at every doorway, its protruding spikes scraping clean frozen sols. A day in the deep freeze. Pre-dawn. Stir awake in darkness, easy when cold air steals sleep. Reignite the hearth without torching the roof, a skill worthy of saga verses. Milk shivering cows while dodging their frost-tinged breath. Daylight hours, what little there was. Men repaired tools in the longhouse's dim light, their breath visible as they worked. Women spun wool, brewed weak, small beer, and monitored simmering stew pots. Children fed livestock dwindling fodder, their mittens crusted with ice. Nightfall, the single hot meal, blood-thickened gruel or stew with rock-hard flatbread. Firelit storytelling oscillating between heroic legends and passive-aggressive gossip. Strategic sleeping arrangements, elders near livestock, newlyweds in drafty corners. The psychological front lines. Winter tested minds as brutally as bodies. Hygiene erosion. Sponge baths with snowmelt led to Viking perfume, a blend of wood smoke, fermented fish, and unwashed wool. Sanitation woes. Chamber pots emptied into frozen pits that became springtime biohazards. Entertainment. Bone dice games, wrestling matches, often ending in livestock panic, and mead-fueled riddle contests. Through it all, a cultural mantra prevailed. Complaints attract malevolent spirits and irritable housemates. Winter always ends, even when the sagas say otherwise. No one ever died from itching, probably. When spring's first drip of meltwater finally echoed through the longhouse, survivors emerged leaner, smellier, and forged into human steel, ready to raid, trade, or simply bask in not being cold for the first time in half a year. Until the cycle began anew. When the northern lights began their ghostly dance across frozen skies, Viking longhouses transformed into the world's coziest storytelling theaters. The central fire crackled like Yggdrasil's roots whispering secrets, casting flickering shadows that made the frost-embroidered walls seem alive. Children burrowed into wolfskin blankets, their breath visible in the cold air, yet their eyes sparkled brighter than unfrozen streams. For tonight, the elders would spin tales that made winter itself tremble. The heart's enchantment. As the temperature dropped until even breath crystallized, Vikings perfected their warmth rituals. Housewives brought out cloudberry mead brewed with summer's memory, its amber liquid swirling in oak cups, each sip like swallowing June sunshine. The children received honey birch sap warmed on flat stones near the fire, its sweetness blending with wood smoke to create winter's defining fragrance. Elderly hands adjusted bone needles to trim oil lamps, the light diffusing through smoke like Thor's chariot wheels rumbling across the roof. The longhouse became a giant cradle, with sheep chewing their cud in the corner providing nature's lullaby. Even the bread-stealing goat, usual mischief maker, laid its head on the youngest child's lap, recognizing Storytime's sacred truce. The talking yarn. The rhythmic hum of spinning wheels composed the overture to these nightly sagas. Mother's fingers danced as we twirled around spindles in endless pirouettes. Every third twist, they tossed a juniper berry into the flames. Know why we do this? A grandmother would pause her darning. These popping berries scare off night terrors. One perpetually drowsy boy discovered that staring too long at the spinning wheel revealed secrets. Unfinished adventures trapped as knots in the yarn. His sister swore last year's crimson thread had transformed into a robin's breast feathers come spring. The frost giant's secret. You think February winds are cold. Grandfather's wooden leg thumped the floor, startling dozing hens. When I sailed to World's Edge, we met a giant taller than glaciers. In these stories, frost giants always sneezed violently enough to shake snow off mountaintops. Clever Vikings learned to smear honey on their shields. When the giant's tongue stuck to the metal, they had exactly 3 seconds to spear its nostrils. Then what? Children demanded, snapping their grass-woven toys in excitement. Then we drank tea made from melted icebergs. The old warrior winked his single eye. Frozen fingers can't grip plunder. A spark leapt from the fire just then, startling the goat into kicking over the honey pot. But no one minded. That mishap would fuel 3 nights' worth of laughter. Spring in the wool socks. By the time tales reached Valkyries riding wolves across the Milky Way, the youngest listeners had curled into sleepy fur balls. Mothers performed Viking sleep magic, heating river stones to nestle in woolen socks as bed warmers, hanging lavender and cedar sachets to ward off nightmares. One boy who'd never admit fearing the dark arranged his guardian battalion nightly. A wooden Mjolnir on the left, a stone raven on the right, and prime position reserved for the snoring tabby cat. Its purrs supposedly scared off even the frost giant's hounds. The Longhouse Observatory. When the last story dissolved into dreams, fathers lifted turf flaps to peer at the sky. Through these frost-rimmed windows, half-asleep children heard murmured star lore. The Big Dipper's scooping seawater tonight. Valhalla's chimney smoke looks thicker than yesterday. These celestial readings dictated tomorrow's chores. A haloed moon meant checking roof reinforcements. An exceptionally bright Venus required polishing ritual silverware. One pretend sleeper memorized all the codes, announcing next morning with authority, Odin says double cheese rations today. As dawn painted the snow's cape mother of pearl, the longhouse echoed with contented snores. Potatoes buried in embers released their earthy perfume. while melting icicles dripped a gentle cadence. Winter's quiet acknowledgement that another story-filled night had been safely weathered. As the endless nights stretched their frosty fingers across Scandinavia, Viking settlements fell into a rhythm as precise as the heartbeat of Ymir himself. This wasn't mere existence. It was a carefully orchestrated dance with winter, where every movement held purpose and every pause carried meaning. The symphony of daily chores. Before the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, longhouses stirred with quiet activity. Women's hands, cracked from cold but never idle, began the morning ritual of coaxing embers back to life. The careful addition of birch bark curls followed by slender pine twigs created a fire that grew like a waking dragon. First smoke, then flicker, finally roaring hunger. Men checked livestock with practiced eyes, fingers probing thick winter coats for signs of weight loss. The cattle's breath rose in steady plumes. Too fast meant illness. Too slow could mean starvation setting in. Children, still wrapped in their sleeping furs, were roused to milk the goats before their restless hooves could kick over precious wooden pails. The language of winter. Communication evolved to match the season's demands. A series of meaningful knocks on frozen doorposts conveyed messages without wasting warmth. 2 raps. Firewood delivery arrived. 3 taps. Neighbor in need of help. 1 long scrape. Wolf sighting nearby. Even the livestock developed winter behaviors. The lead cow's particular moose signaled approaching storms hours before clouds appeared. Knowledge passed down through generations of observant farmers. The mathematics of warmth. Vikings approached heat conservation with geometric precision. Sleeping bodies arranged in overlapping arcs around the hearth. Woolen hangings strategically placed to create warm zones. Cooking pots positioned to maximize residual heat. The wealthiest families could afford soapstone slabs, heated all day, then moved between beds at night like ancient heating pads. Others made do with stones from the hearth, wrapped in rags and rotated through sleeping areas. The hidden economy. Winter revealed the true Viking marketplace, not in goods traded, but in favors owed. The blacksmith's family received extra milk for sharpening tools. The midwife's household got first pick of firewood. Skalds earned warm meals by remembering everyone's favorite stories. This unspoken barter system kept communities knit tighter than the warmest woolens. The winter clock. Time itself seemed to change its nature during the dark months. Morning, defined by the first successful fire. Noon, marked by the angle of light through smoke holes. Night, beginning when the last child's eyelids drooped. The sagas tell of one particularly harsh winter when time froze completely. For 3 days, no shadows moved, until a clever housewife sacrificed her bronze brooch to the gods. Whether truth or metaphor, the story reveals how deeply Vikings understood winter's power to distort reality. The promise beneath the ice. Even in winter's depths, preparations for spring continued. Seeds sorted and stored in sealed antler cases. Fishing nets repaired by firelight. Shipbuilding tools sharpened in anticipation. This quiet work held the same faith as planting in frozen ground. An unshakable belief that winter always ends. When the first drip of meltwater finally echoed through the longhouse, it wasn't just water falling. It was the sound of persistence winning. As the snowdrifts piled higher than a man's waist, Viking wisdom whispered through the longhouse rafters, not in runes carved on wood, but in the 100 small decisions that meant survival. This was knowledge written in frost patterns on window hides and measured by the thickness of ice on drinking troughs. The Book of Frozen Truths. Every Viking child learned winter's alphabet through their fingertips. Icicles hanging straight meant more cold coming. Fox tracks circling the chicken pen signaled hunger in the woods. The way milk froze in the pail told the exact temperature. Old Torbjorn could predict storms by listening to the creak of roof beams. The wood sings different when bad weather's coming, he'd say, his ear pressed to a supporting post. The others laughed, until the day his warning saved 3 fishing boats from being iced into the fjord. The pantry's secret language. Winter provisions spoke in a code only experienced housewives could decipher. Sauerkraut bubbling too fast meant the longhouse was too warm. Mold patterns on cheese indicated where drafts were entering. Honey crystallizing at the bottom revealed the coldest spots. Young Astrid discovered her mother moving food stores every fortnight, not from superstition, but because she'd memorized the longhouse's cold paths where frost crept along the walls. The livestock lexicon. Animals became winter's most truthful messengers. Sheep huddling in a tight circle meant wind changing direction. Chickens refusing to leave their perch foretold heavy snow. The milk cow's utter temperature became the village thermometer. When Gunnar's favorite mare started pawing at the frozen ground, the wise woman nodded. "She smells the spring grass sleeping under the snow," she said. And sure enough, the thaw came 3 days later. The children's winter university. Education didn't stop when the snow flew. It just changed classrooms. Not tying lessons by firelight, with frozen fingers for extra challenge. Saga memorization competitions during blizzards. Mending drills where mistakes meant cold toes. Little Ingvar could recite his family lineage backwards while darning socks, a skill that earned him extra stew when visitors came. "Winter makes us clever in ways summer never could," his grandmother would say, stirring the pot with one hand and correcting his stitching with the other. The hidden calendar. Marking time took creative forms. Notches on a bedpost counted days until the solstice. Yarn knots tracked the moon's phases. Eggshells in a bowl predicted the spring thaw. Eric the Bald kept his own system. He tied a new knot in his beard every full moon. By spring, his chin looked like a storm-tossed fishing net, but he could tell you exactly how many weeks remained until planting. The night watch. As families slept in their carefully arranged warmth clusters, winter's quietest lessons unfolded. The way breath fog moved showed air currents. Frost patterns on wool blankets mapped the night's temperature drops. The intervals between roof creaks timed the wind's intensity. Old Helga claimed she could diagnose illnesses by listening to coughs echo differently in winter air. Whether true or not, her remedies always included honey, garlic, and a stern lecture about wearing dry socks. When the first green shoots finally pushed through the snow, they didn't just signal spring's return. They proved the Vikings had been right all along. Winter wasn't an enemy to defeat, but a teacher whose harsh lessons made them stronger. The sagas would remember battles and voyages, but the real victory was written in the quiet wisdom of survival. As the season's final act approached, Viking settlements teetered between exhaustion and anticipation, like sailors spotting distant land after months at sea. The air still bit with winter's teeth, but now carried whispers of change even children could sense. The hunger moon calculations. By late winter, every household became mathematicians measuring survival in fractions. Half a wheel of cheese remaining meant tightening rations. 3 fingers' depth of firewood required switching to peat bricks. 2 handfuls of grain per pot transformed into stretching stew. Astrid's mother taught her to layer dried seaweed beneath the bread dough, an old trick that made loaves appear larger when baked. "Hunger makes people believe their eyes before their stomachs," she'd murmur while shaping the deceptive loaves. The Great Thaw Wager. Villagers developed intricate betting systems to predict spring's arrival. Birch sap collectors versus sheep shearers on the first sign of warmth. Children's snow sculpture contests doubling as ice melt measurements. Elders reading reindeer shoulder blades like meteorological charts. The blacksmith always won, not through divination, but by noticing when his anvil stopped singing with that peculiar winter resonance. His prize? The season's first bucket of fresh milk, still steaming. The clothing countdown. Winter's wardrobe showed its battle scars. Mittens worn thin as onion skins at the fingertips. Boot soles patched with salvaged leather from last year's shoes. Cloak hems frayed from constant snow brushing. Mothers performed nightly repairs with the gravity of surgeons, knowing one poorly stitched seam could mean frostbite tomorrow. Young Sven secretly rubbed his disintegrating mittens with candle wax, a desperate waterproofing attempt that earned him both scolding and admiration. The livestock rebellion. Even domesticated animals grew restless. Cows kicked over half-frozen water buckets. Hens pecked at their own feathers in coop-bound frustration. The lead goat developed a habit of head-butting the door at dawn. This was when clever farmers began, accidentally, leaving stable doors ajar, just enough for creatures to glimpse the outside world, not enough to actually escape. A psychological trick that kept the animals from going winter mad. The final feast gambit. With supplies dwindling, villages threw a defiant celebration. Last year's mead saved for this exact moment. Hidden cheese wheels revealed like buried treasure. The single salted cod stretched into fish soup through creative chopping. This wasn't just revelry, it was strategic morale boosting. As Elder Gudrun explained while serving thimble-sized portions, better to face scarcity with full hearts than full bellies with empty spirits. The first true signs. Then, one morning, it happened. The subtle shifts only winter-weary eyes could catch. Icicles developed drip rhythms instead of frozen silence. Chickens ventured 3 steps beyond their usual territory. The noontime sun actually cast shadows inside the longhouse. When little Liv tugged off her mittens to feel real liquid water in the horse trough, the entire village knew. Winter hadn't surrendered yet, but its grip was slipping. The last lesson. As Vikings packed away winter's tools, oiling the snowshoes, folding the thickest furs, they did so with the quiet satisfaction of students who'd passed the hardest test. The children, unaware they'd just completed their first survival course, simply chased the first brave butterfly. But the adults exchanged glances that said everything. They'd done it again. Outwitted the cold, outlasted the dark, and proved that spring wasn't just a season. It was a reward they'd earned. As the last snowbanks retreated like defeated armies, Viking children made a game of stomping through the slush, each footprint a declaration of victory over winter. But the adults knew better. The lessons of those long, dark months weren't meant to be forgotten with the first wildflower. The aftermath inventory. Every household conducted spring autopsies on their winter provisions. Salt barrels scraped down to wood grain. Cheese wheels reduced to thumbnail-thin rinds. Wool socks worn translucent as dragonfly wings. These weren't just clean-up chores. They were forensic studies in survival. When old Grimmer found 3 smoked herrings hidden under his daughter's bed, the discovery sparked both laughter and a new rule. Next winter's ration checks would include child height hiding spots. The clothing reckoning. Spring exposed winter's toll on garments with brutal honesty. Mittens unraveling like spiderwebs. Boot linings matted into felt from months of sweat. Cloak clasps bent from constant tension. Women gathered at the washing stream not just to clean, but to compare notes. See how this tore along the weave. Sigrid would point out, demonstrating why next year's cloaks needed diagonal reinforcement. Even mistakes were precious. The stretched neckline on Little Bjorn's tunic proved perfect for layering, sparking a new fashion trend. The animal renaissance. Livestock celebrated freedom with chaotic enthusiasm. Cows kicking up heels in first pasture runs. Chickens rediscovering dirt baths like long-lost lovers. Goats testing every fence for winter weekend spots. Farmers watched this exuberance with knowing smiles and sharp knives. The spring culling was as much about quality control as food supply, ensuring only the hardiest stock bred next generation's winter warriors. The knowledge harvest. Elders held court at mead benches, debriefing the season's lessons. When Asta's chimney smoked eastward, the snow always came within hours. 3 turns of the stars after the last full moon, the fish returned. That patch of moss on the north wall never froze. We should store apples there next year. Children eavesdropping on these sessions didn't realize they were absorbing survival algorithms more complex than any saga. Young Ragnar's doodles of icicle shapes in the dirt would one day save a fishing fleet. The summer preparations. Even as they basked in sunlight, Vikings worked toward next winter. Shearing timed to wool regrowth cycles. Smokehouse repairs made while memories of meat preservation were fresh. Cellar expansions dug where winter's frost patterns suggested ideal cold zones. The blacksmith's hammer rang louder in spring, not just fixing winter damage tools, but forging new ones with subtle improvements. That slightly curved ice chisel, inspired by watching how meltwater ran off roof slopes. The generational transfer. At the first true feast of spring, initiates receive their winter badges of honor. 12-year-olds given their first properly sized ice axes. New brides entrusted with the family's cheese-making paddle. Young fathers presented with the ancestral snowshoe template. The gifts were accompanied by stories, not of mythical heroes, but of great-grandmothers who outwitted blizzards, uncles who invented new fishing hole techniques, and that one time the entire village survived on nothing but lichen tea and stubbornness. The final truth. As children chased the season's first butterflies, their parents watched with quiet pride. These laughing, sun-starved creatures had unknowingly passed their first survival test. The real heirloom being passed down wasn't wool or weapons. It was the unshakable certainty that no winter lasts forever, and no challenge is unconquerable when faced together. When the first autumn chill eventually returned, it would find them ready, not with fear, but with the quiet confidence of those who've danced with frost before and know all its steps by heart. As the wheel of the year turned full circle, Viking elders would gather the young ones close when autumn's first frost painted the grass silver. "Listen carefully," they'd say, stirring the fire with an iron poker. "For winter speaks in riddles only the wise can unravel." The language of the land. Every natural phenomenon became a winter oracle to those who knew how to listen. Frost feathers forming on window hides predicted how deep the snow would lie. The way ravens circled before sunset revealed approaching storm fronts. Tree bark cracking in the cold indicated when to harvest the last medicinal roots. Young Ira discovered that by pressing her ear to the frozen ground, she could hear the distant thunder of glaciers calving, nature's early warning system for bitter winds coming from the north. The pantry's prophecies. Food stores developed their own forecasting system. Barrels of pickled herring that fermented faster signaled a mild winter. Honey crystallizing in hexagonal patterns promised an early spring. Cloudy mead foretold prolonged freezing temperatures. The village-wise woman could taste a spoonful of autumn's last berry jam and predict how many layers children would need come midwinter. "The fruits remember what the air forgets," she'd say, smacking her gums thoughtfully. The animal oracles. Creatures great and small became walking weather vanes. Squirrels that built nests unusually low warned of heavy snows. Reindeer growing thicker fur on their right flank predicted winds from the east. The village cats sleeping in particular formations indicated temperature drops. When Old Grim's hunting dog started digging snow tunnels instead of chasing rabbits, the entire village knew to reinforce their roofs. "That dog's nose knows more than 10 weather stones," Grim would boast, scratching the hound's ears. The children's winter lexicon. Through games and chores, the next generation learned to decode nature. Icicle sword fights taught them to judge ice thickness by sound. Tracking contests revealed which animals knew safe paths through snowdrifts. Breath cloud races demonstrated how cold air moved differently at various temperatures. Little Tove won the season's first honey cake by correctly predicting a thaw, all because she noticed spiders rebuilding webs at a particular angle. The fire divination. Flames held their own secrets for those who watched closely. Birch logs that popped rhythmically indicated coming temperature swings. Smoke curling in spirals rather than straight up warned of humidity changes. Ember patterns that resembled ships meant good fishing once the ice broke. The blacksmith's apprentice discovered that by breathing gently on hot iron, he could create temporary frost flowers that predicted tomorrow's weather, a trick that earned him extra meat rations all season. The final revelation. As the first snowflakes of the new winter began to fall, the village would gather for the telling ceremony. Each person shared one winter secret they'd discovered since last year, from where the best icicles formed for drinking water to how to position your bed to avoid drafts. When the last voice finished speaking, the elder would nod solemnly. "This is how we outsmart the frost giants," he'd say as children's eyes widened. Not with swords, but with seeing what others overlook and remembering what others forget. Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake a tiny messenger carrying winter's secrets for for those who knew how to listen. And so the great wheel turned, as it always had and always would. The last embers of winter's fires whispered into ash just as the first tender shoots pushed through thawing earth. Children who had fallen asleep to the lullaby of crackling ice now woke to birdsong. Woolens that had stiffened with frost were shaken out and hung in sunlight that carried no memory of darkness. In the longhouses, hands that had grown skilled at mending torn mittens now turned to planting seeds. Axes that had split frozen logs were repurposed to shape new ships. The same eyes that had squinted through blizzards to read weather signs now studied cloud formations for rain clues. Winter's harsh teacher was departing, but not without leaving its marks. The grandmother's fingers, knotted from months of spinning, would never quite straighten again. The blacksmith's cough from breathing smoke-filled air lingered like an unwelcome guest. And the children, though they laughed in the spring sunshine, would forever startle at sudden shadows, a remnant instinct from months spent watching for wolves in the twilight. Yet when the first autumn chill returned, as it inevitably would, they would be ready. The wool had been carded with next year's blizzards in mind. The stories had been retold with new details added. The cellars had been dug deeper, the smokehouses reinforced, the livestock bred stronger. For that was the final, greatest lesson winter taught. Survival was never just about endurance. It was about transformation. The Vikings did not return from winter the same as they entered it. They returned wiser, wearier, more resilient. The cold carved channels in their souls where courage could flow faster. The dark honed their vision to see hope in smaller things. The hunger made them appreciate fullness in ways the well-fed never could. And when the first frost came again, they would greet it not as an enemy, but as the old familiar teacher whose harsh lessons had shaped them into who they were. The snow would fall, the fires would be lit, the stories would be told, and life, beautiful, fragile, stubborn life, would continue.